Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI Podcast episode, I continue my discussion with CORE HRIR in India about performance management and assessment and data analytics.
As we think about how we design these systems, the very first thing is to think about how often. Now, there's been a lot in the media lately. Certainly in the U.S., it's been a hot topic of debate. How do we do this and how often? And the traditional model of the yearly performance appraisal, of just doing an end-of-year appraisal, has really lost the sense of value in most organizations. Managers don't like giving yearly appraisals because it's a big time suck on them. They feel overwhelmed because they have to do it all at the end of the year within a short amount of turnaround time. Employees don't like it because they don't find it particularly useful. You can imagine a year-end appraisal, it doesn't usually connect very well with your performance throughout the year. There's usually all sorts of recency bias built into it, and it certainly doesn't give you an opportunity to improve your performance if you had something happen in February, but you don't find out about the performance from your boss or get any feedback until December. So the idea of a yearly performance appraisal is kind of a silly one, and I think most organizations are moving away from it. I would recommend personally that you move towards at least a quarterly appraisal system. That doesn't mean it always needs to be completely formal. But there should be at least quarterly performance discussions with your manager. And personally, I'm of the opinion that it should be much more often than that. And particularly with millennial workers and with Gen Z workers, they expect constant mentoring and feedback. And so if a week goes by where they're not having at least some short, meaningful interaction with their boss about expectations and about the performance and getting feedback on how they've done, then they're not happy and they're not satisfied and they're not going to be engaged and they're going to leave the organization. And so we're getting into the world of real-time performance evaluation. And that actually can really be enhanced through the use of these new HR technologies and artificial intelligence that can help. We actually have just here locally in near the university, we have a small startup company that has created an app for real-time performance evaluation, where every time a supervisor or a boss interacts with their direct report, maybe there's a presentation or maybe there's a client meeting or something happens, that immediately on the app they can rate that interaction, they can provide a quick comment, that feedback goes instantaneously back to the employee who can then ask for clarification, and then it aggregates it over time, and then you can see trends and movements over time about how different aspects of performance is shifting. That's becoming the new normal, I think, and in 5 to 10 years, I think that's what organizations will be doing for their performance systems. So it'll be greatly strengthened by technology. A couple things, though, that we do need to think about, if we can go to the next slide. We do want to think about systems errors and biases. Now, we all have these biases, and because of the biases, we need to have mechanisms to be able to check our biases. We need to have trainings so we can calibrate managers about what it means to evaluate performance, and so they can understand what common biases are and how they can counteract those. Many types of bias. Some of the common ones, we think about the halo effect or the horns effect. The halo effect being, basically one good thing happens, and so then you look through the lens of that one good thing with rose-colored glasses on every other thing that that employee does. So you give them a really high performance evaluation, even though maybe their overall performance wasn't very good, but this one direct interaction you had with them was really positive. That's obviously not going to be effective. It's not going to be fair. The same goes with the horn effect. That's where one negative interaction unduly shapes your perspective of that employee and other ways that they perform. And then we have issues related to validity, reliability, and acceptability and specificity. If we can go to the next slide, really quick diagram of this, you can see how it plays out. Now, of course, what we want, with the best case scenarios we can identify performance objectives that we know align with the organizational mission. We can measure them in real time. We can provide feedback in real time, and then we have objectives that are both reliable, valid, and really connect with the organization's mission and what we're hoping to get from that performance. So here in the targets, you can see a depiction of what that really actually means. Target A, you have poor validity but really good reliability. So all those shots are clustered, typed together. So you have that measurement that clearly it's consistently measuring the same thing well. The problem is it's not aligned well with what you actually need and want in the organization. So you have poor validity, but you have really good reliability. Target B, you have poor validity and poor reliability. They're not clustered, so they're not consistently measuring the same way, but they're also not towards the center of the bullseye. Target C is what we're shooting for. We're looking for clear alignment with the performance objective, how it's being measured, and then the fact that we can consistently over time with different types of managers measure that aspect of performance consistently across divisions with different employees. That's what we're shooting for, because then it's consistent, then it's meaningful to employees. And if we couple that with constant feedback, then employees are going to be appreciative. If we can go to the next slide, please. Finally, and I think just because of time, I'll end with this. There's a few more slides that we won't get to. Certainly being valid, reliable, generalizable, it adds to your assessment method, and that's what you want. But you also have to think about the cost, right? The marginal utility of whatever you choose to do. So it needs to provide economic value greater than the cost of using it. Again, this is actually where technologies are really going to be beneficial, because right now, without technology, without assistance by technology, providing real-time performance management, assessment, and feedback is a crazy thought, right? It's an incredibly onerous task. It would take people so much time to be able to do that. But as technologies are emerging and there's new offerings and new HR information systems and software that can help facilitate this, you really can have a performance management strategy that's moving closer to real time, that's assisted by technology, so that it actually, not only does it not add to the burden of managers, but it actually takes away from the burden of managers, and it takes away those bottlenecks of like the end of the year appraisals where they just get swamped and having to review 20 employees within a couple days and try to be thoughtful about it. That's such a hard thing and such a time suck on managers. But you start to break it up and you assist that through technology, and you're able to chart and graph performance over time. That becomes meaningful to organizations. It becomes meaningful to employees. With that, so there's a couple more things we just won't have time for. Maybe it'll come up in questions. There's some tips on completing and conducting the appraisal. Next slide has thoughts on training managers and employees. That also I think is really important to consider, because ultimately you can have the best system in the world, but if your managers aren't trained well on how to implement it, it's just not going to come off. And so at the end of the day, I think, I know I probably disproportionately spent too much time in this webinar talking about the future of work and the shifting nature of work, but I think it's just so fundamentally vital in thinking about performance management, because the jobs of today won't be the jobs of tomorrow. And we know that we already don't do performance management well now. So So quite frankly, I'm a little hesitant to suggest like a magic bullet to performance management or some system this is the answer to all of your performance management problems. I think there's some principles, there's some strategies that we can consider, but what we need to do is we need to be vigilant and proactive and strategic moving forward, getting the best minds together, thinking about really truly what are the core competencies required to perform the jobs, not just of today, but of tomorrow in our organizations. And if we can do that, then we can start to model the new age of performance management systems assisted by technology and artificial intelligence that we can have the best possible outcome for our organizations. With that, I think we'll just move to Q&A for the remainder of the time.
Thanks, John. We'll move on to the Q&A session, and John, I'll just let everyone see you on video while we speak.
Great.
Great. So, John, our first question is from Rajesh Singh, who states that in current scenario, there is a lack of management support and biases which practically exists in organizations. So, how to develop a robust performance management system that deals with such challenges?
So there's challenge. So basically, you're talking about having a good performance management system within an organization where there's not a culture for it, and you have resistance from the top down. Is that kind of the question?
That is correct.
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a really hard one. Yeah, I'm not sure I have like a perfect answer for it. I'm a big believer in all of us as change agents within organizations. Some of us have formal power. A lot of us don't have formal power. So we have informal opportunities to influence. And, if you're an HR director, but you don't have a seat at the table in the executive room, and you don't feel like you have support from the CEO, or maybe you don't have a CHRO, and you're the HR director and you report up through another VP, and they don't really support what you're trying to do. I mean, that's a really hard scenario. And I think it comes back to constantly trying to show the value of what HR has to offer to the organization as a business partner. So many executives, who have professional backgrounds in operations or finance or some of these other areas, all of course, which are very important to successful organizations, they don't always have a great appreciation for HR, or they might even see HR as as just the money suck of the company. All this money's going in, it's not actually producing anything. And so obviously that's not true. HR done well can increase creativity and innovation in organizations. It can increase performance. You can lower turnover costs, increase employee engagement. I mean, there's all these different things that good HR systems will do to help cut costs and increase revenues for a company. It's our job as HR practitioners to show that value to people up the line, to be able to show it in compelling ways. And as we, within the constraints that we find ourselves in, as we can find opportunities to share that kind of information, then that will, I'm convinced that over time that will resonate with leaders. And sometimes, just like we experience with people that report to us, sometimes it requires a change in personnel and a change in leadership for things to truly take hold. But I'm not a believer in just sitting around waiting for that to happen. So even if I don't feel like I formally have the ability to push a new initiative, I feel like it's my responsibility to, through informal channels, to influence in any way I can and make the case for what I'm trying to do. So that's a general comment to the question. Now, specifically to performance management, I think it's the same thing. So you want a performance-driven accountability culture within your organization, right? You want clear objectives related to core competencies, and you want to measure them in meaningful ways. You want everyone to understand that they're going to be held accountable. Excuse me. You want to make sure that everyone knows that they're going to be held accountable for that performance or lack thereof, but also that they'll be supported in creating a performance plan if their performance isn't up to par at the moment. So that there, you want a culture of accountability, but not a culture of fear. A culture of fear drives down engagement. It increases turnover, and it ultimately doesn't have a good connection with high performance. And so that can be a hard line to walk, right? It's a bit of a tightrope trying to have clear accountability without having a culture of fear. But if you can walk that line and make sure that people know that it's not arbitrary and capricious, that you have clear standards that's being applied across the board to everybody fairly, that there's not nepotism, there's not cronyism, there's not people that get a pass just because they are good friends with the boss, but like literally everyone is held accountable, and then everyone is supported in achieving their goals in the mission of the organization. When that culture starts to emerge, it's a really beautiful thing. And so we make that case. We make that case to management, upper management, to the CEO. We make that case about how utilizing technology enhanced performance management will drive higher productivity of our employees. If we can consistently make that case, then I think we'll have a shot at overcoming some of that resistance. But it most definitely will take time if you're experiencing that in your workplace.
Absolutely, John. I agree to that. And I think it's in the interest of management as well as the entire organization, because a well strategized and implemented performance culture results in employee motivation and retention.
Yeah.
So, moving on to our next question, that is from Aruna Kotru. And, there's a similar question that has come up from a lot of other people from the audience who specifically want to know the best approach or the best appraisal system. Is it bell curve approach, which is recently getting a lot of in fact, a lot of people are not in favor of it, and there's been a massive opposition. So according to you, what is the best approach and the best appraisal system to follow?
A very good question. I think my cop-out answer is it depends, right? It depends on the organization and the culture and the strategic vision of the company. So you have some companies that have sworn by the bell curve force distribution approach of performance. And I think of Goldman Sachs, for example. It's a place where people want to work. It's a career maker. You go work for Goldman, even just for a few years, and it can set your trajectory for a good career. But they burn through people, right? People come in, they burn through them. Some people stay, a lot of people leave. They're not so concerned. They're kind of an employer of choice. Like, people want to go work for them, and so they're not concerned about the churn, right? They're not concerned about the turnover, and they basically put the grind. They just put the pressure on people. And if you're not in the top 80%, it doesn't really matter. You could be an awesome employee. I mean, I don't actually believe this is true, but you could possibly conceivably have a division, like a group, a division or an area at Goldman where you have 10 people and all 10 of them are awesome employees that all deserve not just to stay, but to get promotions and to get raises. And based on their force distribution system, every year the bottom two are gone, right? They're not really going to even consider it. They're just going to keep the top performers. Now, I think certainly there's lots of problems with that, and most companies aren't a Goldman Sachs or a Google or one of these hot tech companies that people want to flock to. Most companies are fighting for talent, and in that kind of a scenario, you can't afford to get rid of a good person just because they don't fall on the right part of the curve. I think that's a silly, arbitrary kind of way of making a distinction. What I think is much more fair, which I think most employees appreciate, is to have clear expectations set, clear performance standards that are articulated, have clear ways that those are being measured, and then have that performance communicated consistently over time, And if you have 5 people on your team and all of them are awesome, then that's amazing. That's awesome. And you don't want to get rid of somebody just because they happen to be the least awesome of 5 awesome people, right? The same goes the other way. You don't, just because you have 5 bad employees, you don't want to keep one you don't want to keep the least crappy employee just because they're less crappy than the other ones. And so keep good employees, get rid of bad employees, have performance plans in place to help marginal employees improve. That's the approach that I believe in. And the specifics of how that gets implemented depends on the culture of the company and how much of an employer of choice you happen to be. You can afford to take a bell curve force distribution approach if you're a Goldman. Most organizations can't do that. And philosophically, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's an appropriate way to do it, but certainly they can get away with it.
Thanks, John. John, we are talking about HR analytics and big data, and a lot of data that we are bouncing with this. How do we use HR analytics to devise strategies to implement performance management and to keep employees motivated?
Yeah, I think it comes back to just making sure you're measuring the right things. I don't know how many on this webinar have seen the movie Moneyball. It's a movie about American baseball. It's a true story. A manager who had a team, a payroll for his team that was way below the average for the league. And so you had big market teams like the New York Yankees, you may be familiar with, that could afford to pay basically 10 times the amount that his payroll could pay for his athletes on his team, but he's expected to compete at the same level. And so this whole movie, it's a fascinating movie. It actually, it's very well done. It was a Best Picture nominee in the US maybe 7 or 8 years ago or something. It's a very good movie in and of itself, but related to HR and related to people analytics, it's a fascinating movie to watch through that lens. And he based the general manager of the Oakland A's, this baseball team, he basically decided he was going to completely disrupt the way that he evaluated performance of the players to see which players had the best value to contribute to the team, to make the team collectively successful. So not individual stars having good careers, but the team collectively successful. And what he ended up doing through analysis over time is recognizing that traditional metrics that have been measured in American baseball for hundreds of years aren't actually the best metrics for who's going to be the best performer to help the team succeed. And he came up with his alternative metrics, and he started to follow those. And then that influenced how he got rid of some players and how he traded for other players. And he built this team that looked a little bit like a misfit team with a really small payroll that was like 1/10 of the payroll of these big market teams. And what happened was they went on to set the record for the most consecutive wins in a row, in baseball history. They won their division title, and they had years and years of great success through this approach. And that approach then started to bleed into American basketball, and American football, and some of these other sports, and get the attention of industry. Now, certainly, this person didn't invent analytics, and he didn't invent people analytics or performance analytics, but he took a new novel approach to trying to think about which performance metrics actually matter. And I think that's what we all need to do, is think about which performance metrics actually matter, and then measure those, and then feed back that data back to our employees consistently and help them see where they're doing well, so that they have that constant motivation to do a little better, but also feel supported in being successful. As we do that, everyone likes to be part of a successful team. Everyone wants to contribute. Well, I suppose not everybody, but most people go to a job because they want to have meaning in their work. They want to contribute. They want to be successful. They want to have a good career. They want to help the company succeed. They want the team to succeed. We want to find ways as managers to help that happen. And when we do that, that increases engagement, that increases motivation, and it all comes down to knowing what we're measuring, because that influences how we write our job postings and how we recruit and who we interview and how we select our employees and how we place them in the right types of jobs. It has implications for every aspect of HR in doing it well. I'm not sure if that fully got at your question. But.
Yes, in fact, in continuation to the same, what our participants would like to know, if you could cite a few practical examples of what organizations are doing globally, through HR analytics, how is it helping in terms of changing trends?
How is it helping with changing trends? Is that
Changing
what you said?
trends and implementing, performance management in a more effective manner?
Yeah, good question. I think every now and then there's new reports put out by some of these tech companies, leading companies like Google, that give us some insights as to what's working well for them. It's a tricky thing because, again, I hate to always say it depends, but it does depend. It depends on a lot of stuff. It depends on the context, the geopolitical, social, cultural context that organizations function in. Depends on the sector and the industry. It depends on the type of organization, the organization's mission, all that kind of stuff. But with that said, with that caveat, you have great examples from tech companies like SAS or Google, who are these big global companies with tremendous success. And what they're doing is they're getting rid of the yearly performance appraisal, plain and simple. So I don't know. I'm sure back in India you wouldn't be familiar with this, but I'm sure you've heard of Silicon Valley, right? In the Bay Area, a tech hub, right? Well, where I live here in Utah, it's actually one of the other really big tech hubs in the United States. We call it Silicon Slopes because we're in the Wasatch Mountains, and we have a big hub of tech companies. We're one of the highest levels of entrepreneurial tech activity in the country. That kind of stuff happening right here where I live. And one of the companies here is Adobe. I'm sure you all know Adobe. They famously, maybe 5 years ago, they famously came out and said, we are done with performance management. We're getting rid of all performance appraisals. And that sent shockwaves. People were really surprised by that. They're like, how can you get rid of performance management and performance appraisals? Now, what did they really mean? Did they really get rid of all performance management? Well, of course not. And does Google not do performance management? Of course they do. It'd be ridiculous to think that they're not doing performance management. But what they're doing and what Adobe did is they got rid of the yearly performance review, the yearly performance appraisal, because what they found is it did nothing to improve performance. It was just this arbitrary process, jumping through hoops, really for kind of legal reasons, right? That you had documentation in case of lawsuits or things, and that really was the only reason they did it. But it wasn't meaningful in terms of motivation or increasing performance and coaching team members, helping them do better, helping drive performance for the organization. And so they just said, get rid of it. We're not going to do performance appraisals anymore. Of course, they still do performance management, but they just moved closer to a real-time type of performance management system where there's regular coaching, there's regular feedback, there's regular interaction between the boss and the subordinates, and that they try to level the playing field so that people feel like they can have those discussions on a regular basis. That's what I see happening with the really innovative companies that are trying to push the envelope on performance management, not locking themselves into kind of rigid practices and traditions that have been done for a long time, but really looking at what's going to fit with our organizational mission and culture and help us to achieve that.
Thanks, John. Yes, a lot of organizations have given up sharing performance ratings and instead focus on sharing continuous performance reviews and feedbacks. Great. Yes. The next question is from Nobarun, who wants to know the useful HR matrices for organization performance management system.
The useful performance matrices for
Yes, useful HR matrices for organizational performance management systems. So matrices to measure organizational performance management system.
Yeah, so this asking about how to measure the effectiveness of a performance management system, not necessarily how to do the performance management system within a given company. Is that the question?
That's right.
Yeah. Again, a very, very good question. I think I'm not sure I have a specific answer for you in terms of specific model or matrix and how to assess. There are certainly a variety of models out there to look at what's being done well and what's not working. I think the first step, though, obviously, is always to get your team together and look at what you're currently doing and look at the track record over the last 2 to 5 years. Excuse me, and try to map it, to try to see what are your goals of your system. Have you seen any evidence that it's achieving those goals? That's the first question. Do you see evidence that it's actually achieving the goals that you've set out? And if it's not, then you have to go further and you have to ask, what's inhibiting, what's limiting this? Is it a systems issue? And a lot of times it is a systems issue. Is it a training issue? Are managers not trained on how to do this effectively? Is it an objectives issue? Are you measuring the wrong stuff? And so you've got the best system with really well-trained managers, but you're just measuring the wrong stuff, and so it's not having the impact, right? So you start to think through these different types of components of what should be in place for an effective system, and then you can start to identify the gaps that might exist in your system and create a implementation plan for improving it over time, whether that means providing more training, getting a new HRIS system to manage the whole thing, different policies and procedures that can help reinforce what you're trying to do. A lot of that needs to happen. One of the things that I see a lot of times in organizations, if I go in as a consultant and I see an organization that's it's not functioning well or it's not having the desired outcomes, especially in larger, more sophisticated organizations, they've usually done the work of having a good system. They've usually done the work, of training their managers. They often have done the work of trying to have objectives that align, right, with what you're actually trying to perform. So they've done those things. But what I see often as being out of place is there'll be conflicting messages, right? So you'll have this whole performance management system that you're trying to implement and do that should align with the organizational culture. But then you have this random thing over here, right? This initiative from an executive or this policy or procedure and these different types of things or different types of communication that come down that are inconsistent with the whole system itself, right? And that causes a lot of problems because, as an employee, I'm sitting here thinking, how do I stay on the good graces of my boss? How, they control my destiny. They control not only do I stay in the job, do I get promotions, do I get bonuses, do I get raises? They control my career trajectory, right? And so my number one goal is thinking about how do I protect myself? How do I help myself moving into the future? How do I make my boss like me? And if I'm getting, there's this formal system with all this good stuff happening over here, but then I have my boss or his boss or her boss saying contradictory things or doing contradictory things, then ultimately what's going to happen? What am I going to do? What am I going to follow? Am I going to really follow all this stuff, or am I going to do what they want me to do? I'm going to do what they want me to do because I'm not stupid, and I know that they're the ones that are going to influence everything. And so I think we want to make sure that our system has alignment, but we also need to make sure that all the components of the organizational system as a whole are in alignment and fit with each other, that you don't have distractors or things that actually undermine what you're trying to do with your performance management system to create that performance culture.
Right. Thanks, John. There are two scenarios. One has been put across by Sai Kothai, who states that non-profit organizations are governed less by performance matrices. In that scenario, how do we appraise the employees effectively?
So how do we appraise performance in nonprofits? Is that the question?
That's right.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's not a lot different than how we would do it in any organization or big corporation or higher ed institution or whatever. Organizations are organizations, and you want to set clear expectations. You want to have clear objectives that align with those expectations. You want to measure them, and you want to communicate and feedback that on a regular basis. And that would apply to nonprofits as well. What often is the case in nonprofits that's a challenge is that they simply don't have the resources. They don't have the resources for the people analytics software, the HRIS systems. They don't have the resources for the dedicated personnel. They often don't have a dedicated HR person if they're a smaller nonprofit. They just don't have the people resources. They don't have the financial resources. They don't have the software resources to be able to do all this seamlessly and well. But the elements of what should be there, I think, is pretty much the same that they should try to be implementing. And so I think this comes back to my point in the slide deck about the cost involved with the system. The reality is we have to be very sensitive to the cost. And if you're in a GE type huge global company, that's one thing. If you're in a local nonprofit with 10 employees where you're scrounging constantly for government funding and grants and donations, and you don't have more people and time, then you have to do what works for you. The nice thing is that we have free systems. They're not as streamlined and they're not as good as the better softwares, but there's a lot you can do with performance evaluation and assessment just using Google tools, right? Google Sheets and Google Docs and various survey tools that are free. There's a lot you can actually do. And so, if I'm going into a nonprofit trying to help them think about their performance management, almost always they won't have that kind of formalized system in place. And one of the things I'll do is try to help them figure out how can they set this up in a way that's meaningful, that's either free or low cost, so that they can start implementing it and not getting bogged down in the process and not getting bogged down in the cost. Does that help answer that question a little bit?
Definitely, it does. In fact, a similar question, but in a different sector. So, and this would perhaps be our last question for the day.
Okay.
We have, project managers who are perhaps working on long-term transitioning projects, or we have scientists who are working on long-term research and development projects. So, what would be the best and most appropriate way to evaluate their performance?
That's another really good question. Wonderful questions by the participants. So I guess really the question, as I understand it, is long-term performance versus short-term performance, right? Like there's some jobs where you just have daily performance that you can measure. And then there's other things that you just don't actually really know if it's successful for like 2 years or 5 years, right? Is that kind of the question? That's how I understand it, and that is hard. And so, I mean, my suggestion would be, what are the intermediate types of checkpoints that you can put in place? So you have this research project that's going to take 5 years. What are the different pieces that go at every stage of that process, and how can you measure those stages? You won't ultimately know if it's successful until the very end, once it leads to publication or a new grant being received by the research team or whatever. Obviously those are clear markers of success and achieved performance. But I'll tell you, I'm in the world of academia, and I can work on a research project for a couple years collecting data, then I can write it up, and then I can submit it to a journal, and then it can take upwards of a year or 2 years even before it goes through the review process, and then goes through the revisions, and then once it gets accepted, it can even take another year before it actually gets published. So it's just this long process, right? So what that means for me as a professor or as a researcher is that I have to have a pipeline of evidence of performance at my university. I have to be able to show them consistent hits, consistent successes. And that means I can't bank everything on one project. So I have many projects going on simultaneously at different stages so that I can consistently show that periodically, every so often, I have that new publication or I have that new grant that's been successful, or I have this new thing that I've done to demonstrate my value, right? And I think that honestly is what you need to do with these research teams, as well as find ways to have checkpoints so if you really have this one major project that they're working on, find checkpoints, of the grant proposal process versus the grant acceptance process. And you can have peer review teams that can go in and help, internal peer review teams that can go in and help evaluate the quality of the work that's happening. So even if it hasn't led to the final outcome yet, you know that it's on the right track. And you can provide that feedback. I think you'd have to have that kind of a system in place.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. I think that was it for the day. We would have loved to continue and have this discussion on and on. But in the interest of time, we'll close the webinar here. And it's been a pleasure having you with us today. Definitely a great opportunity for all of us to have a great learning on a weekday.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure. And as I said before, I think the slides will be shared. Of course, the video will be posted. For any of you who have been participating on the webinar, my contact information, you can look me up on Google, or you can see my contact information in the slides. Don't hesitate to contact me if you want to connect on anything or have discussion or look for a collaboration or something like that. So I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, John. And I would request audience, please feel free to reach out to CORE HRIR team, or you can connect with John directly on LinkedIn in case of any further queries. Thank you so much, John, and thanks to all the participants who've been here. We would love to hear from you and kindly share your feedback. Also, a big thanks to Veer, Bhanu, Kirti, Kashish, and Anu, and many more people behind the scene for their never-ending support to make these webinars a success.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Thanks, John. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.